Hello, civics and economics classes. I am going to read this chapter to you so you have a reading to help you when you work on your reading guide. So, Section 1, what is demand? Americans in action. Have you ever noticed how prices affect the things we buy? Gas prices have been up and down dramatically in the past 5 years, and they affect the types of vehicles that we buy. A May 2004 article in the Christian Science Monitor tells about the impact of high gas prices on one American icon, the gas guzzling SUV. Could the ultimate soccer mom icon really be on its way out? Reports of falling sales for the behemoths, that means big, the beasts of the road, have fueled speculation that Americans may finally be shifting away from the biggest is best mentality. In April, sales on large SUVs fell 15% from the same period a year ago. The story above illustrates a key feature of the American economy. In the United States, demand is affected by the price we pay. To understand prices, you have to understand both supply and demand. We will study demand in this chapter, seeing how it affects price and why it changes. In the next chapter, we will study supply more closely. Then we will see how supply and demand work together to set prices. What is demand? The word demand has a specific meaning in economics. It refers to the desire, willingness, and ability to buy a good or service. For demand to exist, a consumer must want a good or service. Second, the consumer has to be willing to buy that good or service. Finally, the consumer must have the resources available to buy it. The individual demand schedule. A demand schedule is a table that lists the various quantities of a product or service that someone is willing to buy over a range of possible prices. Look at the demand schedule on this page. It shows how many video games George would be willing to buy at different prices. For example, George would not purchase any video game if they cost $50 each. If the price were only $20 per game, though, he would be willing to buy two. The individual demand curve. Demand can also be shown graphically. A demand curve is a graph that shows the amount of a product that will be bought at all possible prices in the market. The curve is drawn with prices on the vertical axis and quantities on the horizontal axis. Vertical is up and down, horizontal is side to side. Each point on the curve shows how many units of the product or service an individual will buy at a particular price. Look at the demand curve on this page. Notice that each point matches the quantity listed in the demand schedule. George would buy 5 video games if the price were $5 each, 3 games at $10 each, and so on. Look at the graph again. As you see, demand curves usually slope downward because people are willing to buy less of a product if the price is high and more of it if the price is low. According to the law of demand, quantity demanded and price move in opposite directions. Of course, this is just common sense. Thinking about your own buying habits. Aren't you more interested in buying more of something when the price is lower than when the price is higher? Individual versus market demand. So far, we have been looking at only one person's demand for a product or service. Companies hope to sell to many people, though. They have to take into account the demand of all these people. They are interested in the market demand, the total demand of all consumers for their product or service. And here are the graphs that you should have looked at. Market demand can also be shown as a demand schedule or as a demand curve. See the examples at the top of this page. A knowledge of demand is essential to understand how a market economy works. As you read in Chapter 18, in a market economy, people and businesses act in their own best interests to answer the what, how, and for whom questions of production. Knowledge of demand is also important for sound business planning. To illustrate, imagine you are opening a bicycle repair shop. Before you begin, you need to know where the demand is. You will want to set up your shop in a neighborhood with many bicycle riders and few repair shops. After you identify an area in which to locate the shop, how do you measure the demand for your services? You may visit other shops and gauge the reaction of consumers to different prices. You may poll consumers about prices and determine demand from this data. You could study data compiled over past years, which would show consumer reactions to higher and lower prices. All of these methods would give you a general idea as to the desire, willingness, and ability of people to pay. Almost everything that we buy provides utility, meaning the pleasure, usefulness, or satisfaction we get from using the product. The utility of a good or service may vary from one person to the next. For example, you may get a great deal of enjoyment from a home computer, but your friend may get very little. Your friend may love pepperoni pizza, but you may not. A good or service does not have to have utility for everyone, only utility for some. The utility we get from consumption usually changes as we consume more of a particular product. For example, when eating pizza, you may be very hungry before you eat the first slice, and so it will give you the most satisfaction. Because you are not quite as hungry after consuming the first slice, you receive less marginal utility or less additional satisfaction from each additional slice that you eat. This illustrates diminishing marginal utility, the principle that our additional satisfaction or our marginal utility tends to go down as more and more units are consumed. The concept of diminishing marginal utility helps explain why the demand curve in the figure on page 450 slopes downward. For example, when we buy something, we usually ask ourselves if the marginal utility we will get from a purchase is worth the money we have to give up to get it. This is exactly the type of cost-benefit analysis we examined in the last chapter. If the extra benefits, the marginal utility to be gained, are greater than the marginal cost, the money given up, then we make the purchase. If the additional benefits are less than the extra cost, we do not make the purchase and we keep the money instead. Because our marginal utility diminishes when we consume more and more of a product, it stands to reason that we would not be as willing to pay as much for the second item as we did for the first. Likewise, we would not be willing to pay as much for the third item as we did for the second. When the demand curve slopes downward, it simply tells us that we would be willing to pay the highest price for the unit we consume, a slightly lower price for the next, and an even lower price for the third, and so on. So that was the reading up to page 451. The questions. What is demand? Chapter 20, Section 1. Question 1. When prices went up in 2004, what is one way consumers, which means people, change their behavior? Number 2. In the United States, what affects demand? Number 3. What two things work together to set prices? 4. For demand to exist, consumers must have the resources to make a purchase. True or false? Highlight your answer. A demand schedule shows how much a consumer will purchase at different price points. True or false? Highlight your answer. In what direction will a demand curve always slope? According to the law of demand, what moves in opposite directions? Number 8, if you are a business selling a product, what is more important, market demand or individual demand? Explain your answer. In economics, what is another word used for pleasure, usefulness, or satisfaction? Utility is generally the same for everyone, no matter the situation. True or false? Highlight your answer. And number 11, provide an example of diminishing marginal utility. So you are now answering questions 1 through 11. You can read the chapter on your own. You can use my reading of the chapter, but you're answering 1 through 11 and submitting the assignment.